Hey, so the lighting is just right for this video. It's just good. That's a coincidence. The sun's come out. Um, I want to talk about generations, which is something I've commented a little bit on before. But I'm going to watch Rebel Without a Cause today with James Dean. Classic film, of course. Dean only made three films. I've only seen it once before in full. But I was impressed, and I got it on DVD, and you can see why it's an iconic film, not just for some of the famous lines, but it's iconographic, actually. Dean, of course, was symbolic of a generation, or personification of a generation, in a sense. I guess, um, see, he died at 24, which meant I guess he would have been born in the mid 30s, unless I'm mistaken. Um, so he's just getting into the silent generation era. But that whole beatnik generation gap thing was beginning in the mid 50s to early 60s. So I'm thinking of this, and I want to talk about my generation, millennials. Now, some people who have similar political ideology to myself, I feel maybe bristle a little bit at the term millennial because they think that, or it's been taken to be associated with a political ideology. But it's important to understand that millennial is just the adjective for people born at a certain time. It's not in of itself a political ideology. So there are left-wing millennials and there are right-wing millennials as well, believe it or not. They may be in the minority, but they're there. I mean, there's millennial Trump supporters. Not many of them, but there are. They're out there. I'm not one of them, incidentally, but um, what I want to talk about is the millennials are a big generation, right? Demographically, there's probably going to be more millennials in the United States fairly soon by numbers than baby boomers. Previously, baby boomers were the big generation. That is, people born roughly from the late 30s to, I guess, um, the mid 40s. Um, that was the baby boomer generation, people who came of age in the late 1960s and early 1970s. There's no clear definitions, incidentally, when we're talking about generations, but that's roughly what we're talking about. So there are people who came of age during the whole counterculture movement, the later counterculture movement, um, in the late 60s. But my generation is very loosely defined as being born from the mid 1980s to the late 1990s. That is, people who came of age in the first decades of the 21st century, i.e., the 2000s and the 2010s. That's myself, right? I'm 34. I was born in 1985, so I consider myself an older millennial. I don't think I'm old, but I think I'm an older millennial. And quite honestly, I'm quite happy about that. I'm actually happy that I was born at a time when people of my age still remember a world without social media. We still remember a time when smartphones didn't dominate everything because social media started becoming really big around mid 2000s. Facebook was launched in 2004, YouTube in 2005. I remember when I first joined up with those websites, and they were still not everyone had heard of them. They were still a relatively new thing. In fact, it was a German friend that introduced me to Facebook, and I didn't know what it was. It was like a new phenomenon, and now it's taken over the world. 2 billion users and so on. So that's an interesting thing because younger millennials, people born in the late 1990s, um, I don't think they will remember directly a time without that because when they became teenagers, it was the early 2010s. So social media was already well, in the scheme of things. Whereas when social media was becoming big, I was already 20 at the time. Um, So a lot of my teens, it was a different, I don't want to say a totally different world, but there were definitely stark differences. Far, far less prominence on social media. Smartphones were around in the 2000s, but they weren't, well, they were around. I was a bit of a latecomer with that. But what I want to say though is there is a point in making with this. Precisely because millennials are a big generation, I think it's a mistake to just assume that some older baby boomers who are critical of what we've seen in recent years with woke politics, they assume that all millennials have that way of thinking. They assume all millennials are super sensitive snowflakes, and I don't personally use these terms, but that's what they think. They think we're all super sensitive, politically correct, progressive, politically speaking. I don't like the term because I think progressive as an adjective just means forward thinking. I don't think you have to be woke to be forward thinking. But summed up, you do not have, not every millennial is woke. Some of us see the nonsense of woke thinking. Some of us dislike political correctness. Some of us don't believe in microaggressions, or at least not that they should be a serious thing. Um, some of us don't believe that there are 50 genders. Um, some of us don't believe in cancel culture. So a lot of the things that get tied with millennials are not entirely fair because it doesn't summarize the whole generation. And as for, being sort of super sensitive snowflakes, don't forget the young men and women who went out to Iraq and Afghanistan. Many of them were millennials, including my brother. Um, these are young people who have seen the most things that most of us can never imagine. They've got life experience. They have been in a war zone. They're millennials. So I think it's wrong to just dismiss all millennials as being ideologically dogmatic wokes because it isn't the whole picture. It's true that probably a higher percentage of millennials are on the political left, but to be honest, I think that's always been the way. I mean, baby boomers were very left wing. They were rebellious. Um, I think it's always been the way to some extent that young people of any generation are rebellious. And if the notion is that the establishment is right wing, then they're going to be left wing. Um, but when people start developing their own ideas and their own philosophy, not just political but personal, um, it doesn't always go with what people assume that is. I mean, I am so grateful I'm not in a British university these days because I think it's got a lot worse since I was there. I mean, certainly, I went to university from 2004 to 2006, and there were certainly elements of it at that time, but I think the whole thing about sort of constant monitoring what people say, and the whole concept of microaggressions, cultural appropriation, all that stuff, all that way of thinking, I do think is a relatively recent phenomenon. I mean, political correctness started developing as an idea in the 80s. So it's been around for a while. It's not an entirely new thing. But the dogmatic and intolerant woke thinking that we've seen of late is a fairly recent phenomenon. I would say in its current form, maybe just the last 5 years. Um, I think in the 2000s we were starting to see early signs of it. I think we were seeing like some indication of it, but it's now become just absurd. And I think what we're going to see in the election, the American election, is of course Biden and Harris are seen as progressives. Biden's been described as probably if he wins the most progressive president since FDR. Time will tell. I think the reality is both the United States and the UK are similar in the sense that most leaders end up being fairly centre ground. Trump being an exception. Trump's anything but center ground. But both Republican and Democratic presidents have been fairly centrist. Okay, the Bushes are more right wing than Jimmy Carter, but broadly speaking, there is certain philosophies, certain principles that were carried to the White House, and even more so in this country. Um, Cameron brought his party a little bit to the left in some areas, Blair obviously to the right, and ultimately, I think the mainstream has been centre ground. Even though recent events with Brexit and the Trump election, you would think that there's been a lurch to the radical side of things, for want of a better term. I actually think that ultimately Western societies gravitate towards the centre in the end. I think sometimes they like this, sometimes public dissent, public discontent likes to shake up the establishment, to express anger, and a lot of that's legitimate. I do think ultimately that's why I think Biden will win. I might be wrong, but I think Trump won because people felt that it was an anti-establishment vote. They really did. And I think there's going to be a phenomenon of the silent Trump voter, but also people who are grudgingly defending Trump, but maybe they've had enough of him. I don't know. I really don't know. And it would be foolish to make, be concrete, sort of like, oh, Biden will win, Trump will lose, because that might not be the case. But anyway, I digress. I digress. What I'm saying is that I feel that a lot of millennials are actually quite centre ground. Um, in my own life, I know millennials that are pretty well to the left, more left wing than myself, but I also know millennials that are fairly to the right, more right wing than myself. But probably most of the people that I know are fairly centre ground, whether centre left or centre right. Um, then maybe that's just bias from who I associate myself with, but it's something I've noticed. So, to conclude, if you're a baby boomer or you're an older generation and you look at my generation and say, oh, you're a bunch of snowflakes, that's misguided. It's wrong. Um, I would also point out that some of this woke thinking, some of this kind of super sensitive cancel culture, the whole concept of microaggressions, a lot of that stuff is actually coming from middle-aged baby boomer lecturers. Some of the most vocal woke people out there are not young, they are middle-aged. I mean, that professor, just as an example, that had a go at Lawrence Fox over his white male privilege, she was a middle-aged professor. Um, so it isn't just young people that are pushing this. I suspect that some of them might be being negatively influenced by pretty far left academics in some quarters. I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but all I'm saying is it's not black and white. Not all millennials are the same, and that's important to understand. Thanks for watching.